Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. I've been gone the last couple weeks. It's good to be home. It's good to be producing these videos again. Today we're going to look at the question, why did Jesus walk on water? And to be more specific, not just water in general, but why did Jesus walk across the Sea of Galilee? Because that is significant. When we look at this particular story from an Old Testament perspective, we're going to see that there's numerous parallels here between this particular story and a lot of things from Exodus and the book of Job and the book of Isaiah and elsewhere that's going to provide us with the light that we need to illumine exactly the full significance of why Jesus did what he did. You see, he wasn't walking on the Sea of Galilee because it was a shortcut. It was the quickest way to get from point A to point B. Nor was Jesus simply flexing his divine muscles, as it were. There was a very specific reason or number of reasons why Jesus did what he did. And as the evangelist Mark records this event, he drops several clues as to which Old Testament stories we need to be looking at in order to help us more fully to grasp the significance of what Jesus did when he walked on the Sea of Galilee. Now, to begin with, I want to offer a contrary opinion that's put forward by a guy named B.H. Branscombe, in which, in reference to this particular story, where Jesus walks on the sea, he says, there are no Old Testament parallels to this story. There are no Old Testament parallels to the story of Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. Well, I guess we'll see about that, won't we? Let's begin with the opening couple of verses from Mark chapter 6. By the way, this story is recorded also in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's recorded in John with a little bit different perspective. It's from Matthew, for instance, that you hear about Peter getting out of the boat and walking a ways and then sinking down. Mark doesn't record that. Mark has a little bit different version of events. So here's how it starts. This is from verses 45 and 46. Immediately, that is immediately after Jesus had fed the 5,000, right after that, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Now, the first thing I want you to bear in mind are a number of parallels between what's happening in Mark and what happened in the book of Exodus, because of these thematic parallels are going to be significant for helping us to understand the implications behind Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. So what are those parallels? Well, the first is this. You have, of course, in the book of Exodus, God, through Moses, giving the people this heavenly bread called manna. And, of course, right before this crossing of the Sea of Galilee, you have Jesus replicating that story as he feeds the 5,000 with this miraculous multiplication of loaves and fish. Secondly, in the book of Exodus, you, of course, have Moses connected with Mount Sinai. Here in Mark 6, you have Jesus going up onto a mountain in order to pray. And then thirdly, and most obviously, in Exodus 14 and 15, you have the crossing of the Red Sea, just as in Mark, you're about to have a sea crossing as well. So keep those thematic parallels in mind as we begin to work our way through the rest of the story. So, that's the opening couple of verses. What do we have next? We're told that when evening came, the boat was out on the sea. By the way, the Greek phrase there is in meso tes thalases, which most translations render in the midst of the sea or in the middle of the sea instead of out on the sea, as the ESV does. So he was out on the sea, or he was in the middle of they were in the middle of the sea, and he, that is Jesus, was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Now, the Greek behind the translation of painfully is basanidzo. And this particular, it's a very strong word. It means torturous or torment. So this isn't just, a little bit of ache in the muscles. This is an extremely painful rowing experience that the disciples are experiencing. Their lives are not in jeopardy, as in the earlier account of the crossing of the sea during the storm. They have just so much wind that they're having this torturous rowing attempt to get across the sea. And by the way, this is important, in Mark 5:7, so earlier in Mark, you have this same particular Greek word, basanidzo, connected with the speech of the demon-possessed man to Jesus, where he says, I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Now, it's going to become important in just a minute. There's also another Greek word that's significant here, and that is elauno. So there we're told that Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully. This particular word can mean to drive, something along those lines. And so it's kind of the image here of they're driving along, they're making headway as their oars are in the water, as they're tortuously rowing, but they're making slow headway. They're driving very slowly through the sea. And this particular word is also used in Luke 8:29 to describe how a man was driven by the demon into the desert. Now, the reason I point out both of these is because both these words have this connection with demons elsewhere in the Gospels. And I think that's kind of in the background here, because what's happening on the sea, as you probably know, we've talked about this in other videos, the sea is emblematic of chaos in the Old Testament. So for the Israelite imagination, the sea is the place of disorder and confusion and chaos. It's not the place of peace and tranquility. So it actually, these particular words that are also connected with demonic activity in other parts of the Gospels, these also kind of fit with the whole picture that we get of the disciples who are in the midst of turmoil, chaos, confusion, this torturous way in which they're barely driving, rowing along. So what Jesus is going to do here is he's going to bring calm, just like, of course, with those who are demon-possessed, he brings calm to them when he drives out the demons who have been tormenting them. Okay, so let's go on to the main section of what happens when Jesus begins to walk on the sea. We read, about the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. Now, that's an extremely important phrase. Only Mark includes it. John doesn't. Matthew doesn't. Only Mark does. He meant to pass by them. Now, we're gonna explore what that means in just a second, but kind of keep it in mind. Jesus meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart," or "be of good courage. It is I." In Greek, that's ego eimi. We'll return to that in just a second as well. "Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So there's so much here. We'll try and get through this just as quickly as possible. Let me first of all highlight three parallels between what's happening in Mark chapter 6 and then what happened earlier in Exodus 14 when God brought the Israelites across the Red Sea. The first of these is you've got a triad happening here. You have the sea, you have the wind, and you have nighttime. So in Exodus 14:21, you have all three of these together as well. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. So just like in Mark chapter 6, so also in Exodus 14, you've got the sea, you've got the wind, you've got nighttime. Secondly, both the Gospel of Mark as well as the Greek version, the Septuagint version of Exodus 14, use the language of the watch. So, of course, the Israelites, as did a number of other peoples, they divided the night into so many watches. And we're told in Mark chapter 6 that this was the fourth watch of the night, which would be about from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., so the last one. That same language is used in Exodus 14:24 in the Septuagint. In the early morning phulake, in the early morning watch, that was when the Lord looked upon the camp of the Egyptians. So that's the second parallel here. And then thirdly, in both Exodus 14 as well as in Mark chapter 6, the people are scared, they're frightened, they cry out, and then they're both told in Exodus and in Mark the same thing. They're told tharseo, to be courageous or to take courage. So Exodus 14:13, Moses says to the people, tharseo, be courageous, be of good courage, stand firm. And then in Mark 6:50, Jesus himself says to the disciples, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. So you've got, of course, this whole constellation of parallels here between what's happening in Mark as well as what's happening or what happened back in the book of Exodus. So we're we're obviously meant to read this crossing of the sea, both the disciples crossing as well as Jesus crossing as he walks on the water, in connection with and parallel to what happened at the Red Sea. The Red Sea, of course, it's impossible really to stress how important it is for understanding so many narratives that date after it. The crossing of the Red Sea is patterned after what was happening at creation. So the crossing of the Red Sea is for the Israelites, kind of a new creation where God brings them into this new existence as the redeemed people of God, brings them out of chaos into order. And then that new creation of the Red Sea becomes the pattern by which God does so many other redeeming acts connected with water in the rest of the Old Testament. And this then informs our understanding of what's happening in the New Testament as well. Now, let's get to this phrase that Jesus meant to pass them by. That phrase that only Mark uses. So, what's the significance of this? What does it mean? Well, let's look at a couple of Old Testament parallels to this, which I think are going to give us the necessary key to unlock exactly the significance of this. The first of these is from this well-known appearance of God, this well-known theophany that's recorded in Exodus 33 and 34. So you're familiar with this. Probably Moses asks to see the glory of the Lord, and God shows him his glory, but the way he does it is he puts Moses in the cleft of the rock, he puts his hand over him, and Moses, of course, is only allowed to see the backside of God as he passes by. Now, the Greek verb that is used in Mark when it says Jesus meant to pass by them is parekomai, which means to pass alongside or to pass by. Now, this is used in a number of places in the Old Testament, almost as if it's a technical term for a theophany. So when God passes by, this is a theophanic, a God appearance to those who are privileged to see it. Now, in Exodus 33 and 34, this particular Greek verb in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, occurs 4 times in this famous theophany. So God says to Moses, I myself will parekomai, I will pass by in front of you in my glory. And then in Exodus 33:22, you have the verb occurring twice. He says, whenever my splendor passes by, parekomai, then I will put you into a cleft of the rock, and I will shelter you with my hand until I have parekomai, until I have passed by you. And then in Exodus 34, verse 6, so the Lord did what? Well, he parekomai. He passed right before him, and he called out, the Lord God, compassionate and merciful, long-suffering and full of mercy and trustworthy. So in this famous appearance of God in Exodus 33 and 34, you have 4 different occurrences of this same Greek verb, parekomai, that's used in Mark chapter 6 to describe how Jesus meant to pass them by. Now, if you are a Greek-speaking Jew in the first century, you know Exodus 33 and 34. You know this famous appearance of God's glory to Moses, and you know that that was a particular language it was used. So when Mark includes this particular phrase here to describe what Jesus was about to do, he expects us to pick up on these connections between Exodus and what he's describing when Jesus meant to pass by his disciples. There's also another occurrence of this particular verb. If you go to Job chapter 9, verses 5 through 11, Job is describing how God is active in various parts of creation. So he describes how he removes mountains, he overturns them in his anger, he shakes the earth, its pillars tremble, he commands the sun, it doesn't rise, he seals up the stars, he stretches out the heavens, and what else does he do? He tramples the waves of the sea. So in the Old Testament imagination, who is it that walks upon the sea? It's Yahweh. It's the God of Israel. He tramples the waves of the sea, and then it goes on to describe how he made the bear and Orion, so he's these constellations. And then in verse 11, we have the same verb used again, parekomai. Behold, he passes by me. He parekomais. He passes by me, and I see him not, and he moves on, and I do not perceive him. So those two particular sections from Job and then Exodus 33 and 34 are are the background that we need to understand what Jesus is doing to his disciples. So I'm going to explain that more in just a second. Let's look at one more Old Testament background to this. This is from Isaiah 51, 9 through 12. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. What's he talking about? He's talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. Here's how it's described. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? That's mythological language that Isaiah has borrowed from his popular culture in order to talk about what God did at the Red Sea. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? Two references to the sea there. Of course, the Red Sea is being talked about. And then he describes how the ransom of the Lord shall return. They'll come to Zion, so on and so forth. And then at the end, verse 12, Isaiah, quoting God's words, says, I am he who comforts you, which in the Greek translation is ego eimi, ego eimi. Now, if you go to Mark chapter 6, verse 50, that's the same language that Jesus uses to speak to his disciples. Take heart, ego eimi. It is I. Do not be afraid. Now, it just so happens that ego eimi is the I am statement that we hear so much about. This is Jesus' way of indicating his divine identity. He is saying, I am Yahweh. I am the Lord God of Israel. So I'm the one of whom Isaiah is speaking. I am the one that's being talked about in the book of Job. I'm the one who appeared to Moses when I put him in the cleft of the rock. Jesus is saying that just as I revealed the backside of my glory to Moses, and just as I'm the one that Job talked about, now I am I'm trampling on the sea like Job talks about. I'm the one who's crossing this sea just like I crossed the sea with the Israelites in days of old, and I am Yahweh. Jesus is claiming divine identity. He's saying that I'm the one who appeared to Moses in the burning bush. I'm the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. I'm the one who tramples the waves of the sea. I put the constellations in the sky. I am none other than Yahweh in the flesh. And he goes to his disciples in order to reveal himself to them. He means to pass them by in the sense of he's about to reveal exactly who he is. And of course, the disciples are astonished when they realize what Jesus has done. He gets in the boat, and what happens after that? There's a great calm. Now, the disciples, they still don't get it. They didn't learn exactly who Jesus was from the feeding of the 5,000, and they still are grappling with who he is. Of course, in the Gospels, nobody really gets who Jesus is until after the resurrection and the coming of Pentecost. Now, as we read through these stories, in light of everything that we know from his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, and Pentecost, we see that what's happening on the Sea of Galilee is that Jesus is revealing to his disciples, and of course still to us, his church, who exactly he is. He's not a creature. He's God. He's Yahweh, come in the flesh to be with his people. And now he is recapitulating, he is redoing the crossing of the Red Sea as he crosses the Sea of Galilee with his disciples. And just like he brought his own people safely to the other side in Exodus 14, now he's going to bring his own disciples safely to the other side in Mark chapter 6. So let's sum up some of this and see what we can bring together. So Jesus walks on the sea. You've got the manna connection, the mountain connection. You've got the Red Sea connection. You hear echoes of the demonic possession in the sea with this torturous activity and this slow progress. You've got Exodus 34 with the revelation of God's glory. You've got Job 9 with him trampling the seas. You've got Isaiah 51 with him claiming, I am. All that is a textual background to what's going on in Mark 6. And then, of course, you have the parallels of the wind and the nighttime and the language of take courage. So let's return to our quote. There are no Old Testament parallels to this story. Well, let's fix this. Let's fix the quote. Here we go. The quote is now fixed. There are multiple Old Testament parallels to this story. There's not just one. It's not just Exodus 14. But it's Exodus 33 and 34. And if you want to go back all the way to Genesis 1 and 2, you can look at that as well. You can look at Job 9. You can look at actually a number of passages that we did not even take the time to look at. They all provide this rich, layered backdrop to what's happening in Mark chapter 6. As Yahweh now come in the flesh, he steps onto the waves of the sea in order to bring his disciples, bring his people now to the other side, just like he did in days of old, revealing that he has come to bring about for all of us a new exodus, a new creation, all the gifts that the Father desires us to have. So that is this week's video on reading the Gospels through Hebrew eyes. Let me also point out to you one thing. Today, I am recording this. It's a Monday, and tomorrow, so depending on when you're watching this, but it's going to be July 20th, my next book, which is called The Christ Key, that releases. So maybe some of you have pre-ordered. If you haven't already done so, or if you haven't heard about it, The Christ Key is basically how to read the Old Testament with Christ front and center all the time. How to see Christ as the fullness and the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. You got about 3 decades worth of work that I've compressed into this particular volume. You can get your copy at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or the 1517.org store, wherever you buy your books. Thank you for watching. I pray that all of you are doing well. Again, it's good to be back doing these, and I will continue these for the next few weeks. So thanks for watching, and may God's grace and mercy be with each of you. We'll see you next week.